Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to this episode of Compliance into the Weeds. In this episode, Matt and I take a look at a recent ECI report which compared compliance programs at large, medium, and small enterprises. It had some really interesting insights that every compliance practitioner needs to consider. I know you will enjoy this episode of Compliance into the Weeds. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, back again with Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, for another episode of Compliance into the Weeds. With luck, we are now live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and perhaps a couple of other channels. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat function and send them to us. First of all, Matt, welcome to the old and new Compliance into the Weeds live edition.
Hi, Tom. It's good to be here, and I am excited that we are actually able to pull this off now with good Wi-Fi connectivity.
Matt, you got interested in a recent ECI report that looked at things, compliance programs, and some issues in a little bit different angle. What got you interested in this ECI report?
Well, this was interesting because ECI, which has long published lots of thought leadership and research on compliance programs, ECI broke that down by company size and what sort of experiences employees had around business ethics issues, depending on whether they were at a small company, which is 500 or fewer people, a medium company, which is 500 to 1,000, or a large company, which is 1,000 or more. And this was all based on data that ECI had pulled together over the summer of 2020 in a large online survey that ECI had conducted. I know that means the data is a little bit dated, but I don't think the findings themselves would be all that out of date. They seem to make a lot of sense. We can get into what the findings are. But more than anything else, Tom, what stood out to me in total was that clearly middle-sized companies are in a bit more of a squeeze than either small or large companies. They're more likely to say, employees at medium companies, more likely to say they feel pressure to commit misconduct. They're more likely to observe misconduct. They're more likely to suffer retaliation when they complain. That's what they all say. On the bright side, employees at medium enterprises also are more likely to report misconduct and more likely to report incidents of retaliation. That's nice. But we have an interesting picture here that tells an interesting tale compliance officers could use to think about how you staff up and implement your own program.
So before we get to maybe some of the insights that you drew from this, Matt, in addition to sort of the big picture numbers you gave us, could you maybe go in a little bit to the weeds about what the actual numbers were in the small, medium, and large size companies, both in terms of reporting, those who may have observed misconduct and retaliation?
So let's see, where are they? I have some numbers we can share. So for example, who feels pressure to commit misconduct at what organizations? Medium organizations, 52% of employees said they felt some sort of pressure within the last 12 months to commit misconduct. That is higher than either large organizations, where only 28% said that, or small organizations, where only 30% said that. Or at the same time, who was likely to report misconduct or incidents that they had seen. So the good news is the numbers are pretty high on who is likely to report across the board, but the numbers would be 93% for medium organizations. That's nice. Versus 87% at small organizations and only 80% at large organizations. We should circle back to that number because I have some concerns about large organizations with that 80% number. But, you know, we do see that. Here's one more statistic I'll throw out. Employees at medium-sized enterprises are more likely to have observed unethical behavior, not necessarily felt pressure to do it themselves, but they just saw it happen somewhere. So the numbers were 71% at medium companies, 54% at small companies, and 55% at large companies. So any way you look at the more alarming head-grabbing issues, who's seeing misconduct, who's feeling pressure to commit it, who's suffering retaliation, medium-sized companies were at a fair margin above, not a small little squeaker in the first place. They were easily in first place across several categories over small and large companies alike.
So, Matt, if you are in a small, medium, or large company, how might you, or how would you counsel someone in one of those shoes to maybe begin to think through these numbers?
Well, so it's hard to say exactly why mid-sized companies might be in this red zone. And the ECI report has a lot of good data to look at. It touches lightly on what might be going on with mid-sized companies, but their example of why mid-sized companies might be suffering a bit more is probably a good point for every compliance officer to think about. It's ECI has seen before that pressure to commit misconduct tends to increase during periods of organizational change. Now, what is that? That is things like IPOs that you're looking to do, mergers or acquisitions that your company's trying to digest, a restructuring that might be going on, change of leadership. So anything like that is probably going to bring stress to the employees and the workforce. And that's a very short jump from I feel stressed to maybe I have to commit misconduct. Maybe I'm being told to, maybe I see it going on over there. But when you think about it, what sort of company is most likely to go through those periods of organizational change? I would say probably middle-sized companies are. If you are a large company, you've already done the IPO, you've already had mergers before, you've already gone through restructurings before. That's somewhat old hat for a large company. At the same time, by the other extremes, smaller companies, they probably haven't yet reached that critical mass where they're really starting to put structure and apparatus around things. If you're a small company, you're probably not thinking about an IPO right now. You might not necessarily be thinking about acquiring a company. Maybe you want to get acquired by private equity or something like that. That's possible. But a lot of those growth pains, they tend to hit in this corporate adolescence, which is a mid-sized company. So, that's why I think middle-sized companies are probably in this danger zone. But for anybody, small, medium, or large, you could start thinking through, well, what are the sort of corporate growth pains my company might hit anytime soon? And then I should start thinking through, are we prepared for that? And different types of misconduct are reported at different size companies. That's another little nifty data chart that ECI churned out. You could think a bit about that as well. Maybe there are different tools or program components you would want to implement or strengthen, depending on if you're small, medium, or large. We could talk about that too. But that's what I would advise compliance officers: understand the size of your company, but also understand that broad point from ECI. Corporate disruption and organizational change are weak periods. And so are you going through that weak period? If you are, what kind of weakness or what kind of change are you going through? And then, all right, let's reverse engineer. How might that affect misconduct here? What sort of supports would we want to throw in or strengthen to make sure that we're in a good position if the change is going to lead to temptation or greater pressure?
Matt, wrote obviously a blog post on this, so we're going to link to it in the show notes. But Matt, after reading your blog post, what came up for me was a question I'm often asked, which is along the lines of the following: when do we need to get internal controls in place in our company? We're a 6-person, we're a 60-person, we're a 600-person company. And my answer is always as soon as possible, if not sooner, because internal controls are not designed for compliance, they're designed as financial controls. And you could piggyback your compliance off of your financial controls. It seems to me that by implementing a robust system of internal controls, somewhat based on SOX, you could, if you have a small company, that would help in this growth phase of the middle companies that the ECI report has seen, where there's perhaps more troubling conduct. Any thoughts about when a company should put those types of controls in place, or does this information suggest something else to you?
Well, I think it's very valid to say if you embed internal controls while you're a small company, you'll be in much better shape as you edge into the medium-sized company zone, and then you might hit more periods of change more quickly, but you'll already have those control structures in place that will help you out. That's very good to keep in mind. I would maybe expound a bit more on what internal controls are. And, really they're about bringing formality and structure to judgments that at an extremely small company, a startup of 20 people, you probably could get away with very few internal controls because you've got few people and they're working together so closely that you can exercise a lot of direct human oversight and human judgment on something like, say, reimbursement for personal expenses, where really, if you're looking for only 4 or 5 receipts for an employee on a business trip, and there's only 2 or 3 of them who would ever take a business trip in a quarter, a CEO or CFO of a 20-person company, so like micro scale company, you can do that pretty much with paper and judgment, knowing the person. But eventually you will want to put in more structure if you're at 100 people, where suddenly you're thinking, all right, it's not just about personal expenses, it's about budgeting, and it's about things like purchase orders and invoices for other expenses that we might incur, and how are we going to get around this? So there are different types of structures that will need to exist at different periods, depending on how quickly you grow, how quickly you think you're going to grow, what types of business you're in. Tom, you said internal accounting controls are about finance. They are, but they are also, I would say, about cybersecurity and handling of personal private data. The through line there is that there's going to be structure and formality so that the process unfolds regardless of who is actually at the business. When you go from 10 or 15 people where everyone knows everyone to 50 to 100, suddenly it is much more depersonalized, and you're going to need internal controls to guide the structure, to guide the process, no matter who this person is. Once you get into that sort of muscle memory at a smaller level, you're going to be able to keep that even as you scale up to medium and large size. And don't get me wrong, as you scale up, some of the internal controls that you had, some of the processes and systems, you're going to have to replace those. Eventually, if you're a huge company, you're going to need an SAP system or Oracle or some other big monstrosity, and you're going to need all sorts of controls for purchase orders and invoices and onboarding new vendors, and I couldn't even speculate about what else. But the sooner you start that exercise, the more you'll be able to repeat the exercise as it gets more complicated with growth.
And Matt, the other thing that your blog post brought up for me was I observed, particularly in energy companies in Texas, smaller companies, when they were truly small and as they grew, they might have a legal resource, a general counsel, typically did not have a full-time or dedicated compliance officer. But the numbers would seem to suggest at some point that model is just outgrown by the number of employees. So I'm wondering, from the companies that went from small to mid-size, did they have a dedicated compliance function or resource? Did they have a subject matter expert? And is there at some point that a company really needs to bring in not simply a compliance program, but really compliance talent in the form of some type of a compliance officer or chief compliance officer to maybe head off some of the problems that ECI observed in medium companies as well?
So the short answer is yes. That is the pattern, and it makes sense. A lot of the data that ECI put forward there just makes a certain amount of logical common sense that stronger ethical cultures correlate with a strong compliance program. Now, I'm still unsure in my own brain about which one is responsible for which. Does a strong compliance program boost the culture, or does a strong ethical culture make it easier for companies to embed a good compliance program? I think we could debate that on another day. It's probably a very good debate to have. But ECI did say that the larger you are, the more of these compliance program elements you have. Again, like kind of a common sense finding. It shouldn't surprise anybody. I would say that, going back to what I mentioned before, not necessarily all elements need to be put in place for a proper sequence. Say, for example, it might depend on your industry, your geographic operations, where you are, corporate size. Um, maybe say training and written standards for behavior would be more helpful at smaller organizations than a formal hotline. But at a larger organization, I would say if you're going to strengthen anything or watch anything, watch the hotline and case management systems and make sure they're well functioning and integrated, because that helps you resolve cases more quickly. And at a large company, that's the thing you have to show the workforce, is that we can resolve a complaint quickly. Then they understand that even at this big, vast, impersonal corporate thing, the company still cares about me and the issues I'm bringing forward, so I still want to report them. And that's what you're trying to achieve at a large organization. I don't know that you would need to achieve that at a small organization, because if there's only 50 people and everybody knows the CEO, it's going to be pretty easy for a good CEO to show that, yes, I do care and I am not a big, vast corporate enterprise. But you might want more training at a smaller level, whereas at a larger level, training is already pretty much should be like a smoothly functioning, well understood part of compliance. So, a way of saying you will eventually need all elements, but which ones you need at what time, they are going to depend on a couple of different factors, including just the size of your company.
And I really applaud ECI for looking at it in this way, and for you writing your blog post, which really helps us delve into some of these. I wanted to take things in a completely different direction, playing off your well-known love of Cambridge and the university associated with Cambridge. This is a university not associated with Cambridge, but also in the Ivy League, Yale. And Yale last week, it was revealed that an employee in purchasing who'd been with Yale for some 23 years had embezzled over $40 million from Yale University. Did you get a chance to look at any of that?
I will have to admit I did not. But of course, being from Cambridge, we have multiple universities in Cambridge that are, of course, better than anything anywhere else in the world. I am not surprised. That's unfortunate news, but I haven't been briefed on the facts of the Yale case yet. That's certainly a sorry thing to hear about.
The thing that intrigued me the most was that there was a level of review of purchases for invoices above 10,000. And for years, she lived with invoices at $9,990.
Yeah.
And it just made me think about all of the times that our internal audit friends have talked to us about those limits and people that hang around those limits. And she just didn't buy a few lunches with getting close to the limit. She had quite a nice lifestyle, even for someone in New Haven. So perhaps we can look at her somewhere down the road.
It's funny though, Tom, because the numbers that you're talking about are larger than what I've heard elsewhere, but this is not a new story. And I know, for example, multiple large public utilities where they have a special approval process for gifts and entertainment receipts above $50. And they specifically look at which employees are submitting receipts at $49 and how often they are doing that. So again, this is like an example of, with good data analytics and a cynical attitude, you could probably build good mechanisms to figure out scams like that. That is unfortunate, but Yaleys, the Eli's, it's just a sad state of affairs for those folks down the road.
Well, Matt, this has been a lot of fun, very informative, and I look forward to seeing what we come up with next week.
Thanks, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. We're going to link to Matt's blog post in the show notes and the ECI report as well. Please take a look at them, as they provide some great insights. I hope you'll join us again next week for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds.